Well, thank you so much for coming this evening. And sorry if you were coming for the other talk and you've got me. We'll just have to make do. Okay, well, after that wonderful introduction, I'll cut straight to the chase and talk about the man who's shining brightly behind me, Alfred Waterhouse. Some of you may be familiar with his work. For some of you, it may be the first time you've ever heard him mentioned. But I hope that by the end of the evening, you leave the room not only a fan of his work, but a fan of some of his buildings as well, and an appreciation of architecture. Now, I am going to mainly talk about the architect tonight, but that doesn't mean that I've forgotten all those hard-working builders, whether it was from a humble labourer to the most skilled craftsman who built Waterhouse's buildings, because without those men, principally men they were at those times, Waterhouse wouldn't have got his buildings. So behind every great designer, there's the team that make it as well. So we must always remember those too. So a little bit about me, and the evening isn't about me. As was mentioned in the introduction, I, unlike Alfred, was born in the south and then moved north, where, as we're going to see in due course, Alfred was born in Liverpool, and then as his career became more and more successful, he eventually moved south. A little bit more about me. I am a qualified London Blue Badge Guide, which I did a few years ago, but I've been living in Wigan now since 2017. So that explains why I've got that funny accent, and I haven't just fully cracked the Wiganese just yet. But it's a real honour and a thrill to join you here tonight, because this group, despite my funny accent, we've both got something in common. We all have a passion of history, heritage and arts, which is so important to me and to every person in this room. And also, we share a love for Wigan. And I definitely have had that love as soon as I came up. And even before I met my partner, who is from Shevington, I was always interested in Wigan, principally in the late 1980s because of the marvellous rugby league team of Ellery Hanley, Andy Gregory, Sean Edwards, etc. You know the names more than I do. And then in the early 90s as well, there was a band called The Verve that I was a big fan of as well. And some of you who like your music appreciate that they came from Wigan too, just joining one of a many number of good musical groups. And if I get a few music references in tonight in an architectural talk, don't be surprised. And as has been said, I am not an architectural expert. So if there are any architects here in the room, then if at the end of the night there are any technical questions that are extremely difficult, I'll defer to your wisdom and judgment. Okay, so that's okay. So a little bit about Alfred Waterhouse himself. What we're going to do, the breakdown of the talk, we're going to look at his early years. So how did Alfred become an architect? How did the kind of career start? We're then going to have a look at Alfred in Wigan, because he was important in designing some of the buildings that's in the area. Sadly, some of those buildings aren't in the greatest repair, as we shall see, and sadly, one of the buildings is no longer with us, but he has played an important part in Wigan architecture. So principally, that's what caught my passion to give this talk here in Wigan, was his importance because of the buildings that he's been involved with. He's also been responsible for a number of great buildings in the northwest of England, principally in Liverpool and Manchester, but I'll also look at one of his probably most striking examples of domestic architecture. Then we'll deep dive into a couple of his buildings in the Liverpool area, and then we'll look at some of his work in London and then the end of his life as well. So we'll cover quite a lot of the areas. Now, principally, his most famous works are the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. If any of you have ever been down to that in London and seen the dinosaurs, it's a fantastic building, it really is. And also probably his most famous, important building in the northwest is Manchester Town Hall. I'm not going to go into massive details about Manchester Town Hall tonight. So if you are a Manchester Town Hall devotee and you are hoping that the whole talk would be about Manchester Town Hall, I'm sorry for disappointing you. I'm going to talk about some more of his obscure work rather than his number one hits, if you don't mind. Okay, so Alfred Waterhouse, the early years. And for those of you who might be able to see that building on the right-hand side, that is what was known as Wigan Public Hall. Now that's in King Street. Sadly, the building was demolished in the 1980s. This wasn't a building that was designed by Alfred Waterhouse. However, it was designed for the person that he first joined architectural practice, who was a man called Richard Lane. So Alfred was an apprentice to Richard Lane in 1848. And as you can see there, it was a striking building. Now, if you're trying to picture where in King Street that building would be, it's basically opposite Revolution. That's where that public hall used to be, and it's just a sad day when that was knocked down. But sadly, it's just part of the one of the sad losses of the Wigan architectural history. He was born in Liverpool in 1830, and his father was a rich cotton broker. Now, we all know that the cotton industry, both in Manchester, Cottonopolis as it became labelled, but more relevance to here, the cotton industry in Wigan was massive. It made this town along with the coal industry. And so you can see that with the father doing well, he was able to get his son educated, and he became an architect, being successful. He had 8 siblings, one of which was very famous as well, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in due course. He was born in Liverpool, but at quite a young age, the family moved down to London, and he studied in it was a Quaker family, so they were what were called nonconformists back in those days, and he lived in what was a villagey part of London at the time, Tottenham. Now, if anybody has been down to Tottenham, for example, if they went to last year's Challenge Cup final, Tottenham no longer has that villagey feel. I think it's fair to say it's an area where gentrification is a process still occurring rather than has happened. I'm trying to be kind to Tottenham in this description, to be fair. And so, as I say, he was apprenticed to Richard Lane. So I don't have proof that when Richard Lane was working on this building in King Street, that Alfred Waterhouse came to Wigan, and that was his first visit to the town. But I strongly suspect so. And then what does one do when one's researching and studying for architecture? Well, any gentleman worth their while back in those days would do what was known as the Grand Tour. And he did an architectural Grand Tour where he travelled extensively in Europe, visiting France, visiting Switzerland and Italy. And as we shall see, this definitely had an influence on his work and was very influential. And then he established his own Manchester practice, 1854 to 1865, and then established, as the buildings became more and more successful, he moved down to London and he established his London practice. So, Alfred Waterhouse, a little bit about him. He was a member and president, as he became more successful, of RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. So even today, this is the most influential body in the UK School of Architecture. Just as with doctors for the BMA, for architects, it's RIBA. He was also treasurer and a member of the Royal Academy. Now, I want to really convey to you the link here between architecture, focused on the design of buildings, and art. Because to me, architecture is an extension of art, and good architecture is a work of art. He was also a master of rational planning, because one can't design and plan these amazing buildings if you don't know what you're doing and at what stage follows onto each other. And then he was awarded the Royal Gold Medal in 1878. Now, what the Royal Gold Medal is basically the Oscar for architects. So it's like to be called, last night we had the Oscars and you were awarded Best Actor. So the Royal Gold Medal basically is you're recognised by your peers and by the experts as the greatest person in the field that particular year. So you can see there on the slide, some of you who can read that closer. Other such winners were in 1859, George Gilbert Scott. Now the quote, in terms of who was the greatest Victorian architect ever, I'm not going to claim Alfred Waterhouse is, but I definitely would say he's a leading contender. But definitely one of the strong competitions for that title is George Gilbert Scott. Some of his buildings that you might be familiar with in London is the Midland Hotel. If anybody's ever been down to King's Cross St Pancras and sees that marvellous hotel, also featured in the Harry Potter movie, then that's one of Gilbert Scott's works. Also the Albert Memorial opposite the Royal Albert Hall, that's another example of Gilbert Scott. So that's his work. Another winner was G.E. Street. I'll return to the work of G.E. Street a little bit later on in the talk. And then the American architects who use more contemporary times, or relatively contemporary times, Frank Lloyd Wright won the award in 1941. And then more recently, some of the architectural giants of modernism, for example, and futurism. Sir Norman Foster, 1983. You may be familiar with some of his works. Norman Foster, he did things like the Wobbly Bridge, the Millennium Bridge was a Norman Foster, the Gherkin in London. He did the HSBC Bank in Shanghai. And architects has definitely been a successful growth industry in terms of British industry in the last 20 or 30 years. And sadly, there's not many areas of British industry we can say that, but definitely architecture has been one. And Dame Zaha Hadid in 2016, again, she was responsible for one of the buildings in the Olympic Park as well. And she's also done a number of work. Sadly, she's no longer with us, but she's done a number of work internationally as well. So good company for Mr. Waterhouse to keep himself in. So what type of buildings did Alfred, as we shall call him now that he's our friend, design? Well, he did a mixture. He did religious buildings, domestic, educational, commercial, public, civic buildings, and in a varied style. But as we shall see with a number of the buildings, he definitely had some go-to devices and processes that he used. So let's talk about his style. And when one's talking about Alfred Waterhouse, one always hears the term Gothic revivalist, and we'll talk about what Gothic architecture is in a moment. Another tag that people would give him was Wagnerian Gothic, which is, if you think of the drama of Wagner and his operas, and use that emotion of Wagner, that kind of gives you the passion and the fury that Waterhouse sometimes brought to his work. Not everyone was a fan, of course, so slaughterhouse was one of the insults that was given to some of his work, as we shall see, and he was master of secular Gothic. Possibly because of his Quaker religious background, he didn't get many church commissions. If you think about how still influential the Church of England, the Anglican Church was, and the number of great buildings that were built in the Victorian era in terms of cathedrals and English churches, largely Waterhouse missed out. And that's possibly because he wasn't part of the Anglican the establishment. He was very much an outsider, being a Quaker, yet he still managed to get a number of important works, as we shall see. And he was also been called hero of historicism. So it's a bit of a fancy term, historicism. I do well to even manage to say it, which is why I'm on the water rather than the beer. But it basically means he used inspiration and influence from different periods of history. That's all historicism means. If there's any technical terms, I'll try and explain them as we go along. So let me talk about Gothic architecture, just to give you a broad definition of what it means. In traditional architecture, there's two main styles. There's Gothic and there's classical. So if I was to give you an example of classical architecture, it basically draws its inspiration and its influence from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So think the Parthenon, think in Rome, think the Acropolis in Athens, think St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and you'll have classical architecture in your mind. Now, Gothic architecture, as you can see here by my rather brooding picture of Salisbury Cathedral, is a little bit different. It draws its influence from medieval France. Think of those great cathedrals of Notre Dame, of Chartres, of Saint-Denis. So they were the two main contrasting styles in architecture, in the big architectural war. You were either, think back to Britpop of Oasis and Blur. In architectural wars, you either were a Gothic or you were classical. And our man Waterhouse was definitely Gothic. Sadly, in terms of the Goth subculture, it doesn't have much relevance to the architectural style, but I like to think that Goths still visit Gothic cathedrals as well, just to keep on that. So it was originally called the French style, as I say, because it originated in those Middle Age 11th, 12th century, 13th century cathedrals in the northwest of France, and then spread around Europe. As soon as the Normans came, again, you can see that they started to build from Romanesque, from their Norman style, and the Norman style evolved into Gothic. So if you go to somewhere like York Minster, again, a wonderful example of a Gothic cathedral. Examples in Europe, as I've put there, or in England, as I've put there, are, so London's got that interesting contrast of the great classical example of St. Paul's in the city of London, and then to the west in Westminster, you've got the Gothic of Westminster Cathedral. And the Gothic tag was actually derogatory. It was put up by the Italian Vasari as an insult against the purer classical styles. And yet there was a period, particularly after the Reformation in England, in the 16th, 17th century, where the classical style was seen to be too Catholic and too foreign, whereas the Gothic style was seen to be more traditionally English. Now, isn't that a little bit typical that something that came from France then was suddenly developed to be typically English? But not the first time. And then in terms of the technicalities of what is Gothic architecture, in terms of some of the cheese, so very much that rather than that. And then things like pinnacles on a building. So these are pinnacles. Vaulted arches. So basically a vaulted arch is a form of support. So as cathedrals got larger and larger, and the stonemasons and the architects wanted to fill them full of glass, then you needed taller walls to support all this glass instead of stone. And that's why he uses things like vaulted arches just as a support basis. And again, I'm not going to get too technical, but just to give you some of the basics of the difference in architecture. In the 1830s, British architects began to look more seriously at medieval buildings, and that's why the Gothic form had a bit of a revival, and that's why Waterhouse is known to be one of the great Gothic revivalists. Now, a person that you may have heard of, Augustus Pugin, is in one program they gave him the title of the God of Gothic. Now, Pugin, again, was an absolute genius. I think he died by the age he was 30. I think he had 3 or 4 wives, and he ended up in a lunatic asylum. But the man was a real rock and roll star in terms of architecture, but sadly he burnt out too early and too young. Now, he's been responsible for a number of churches around the country, but probably his most famous work is the interior of the Houses of Parliament. So if ever you've been lucky enough to go round the inside of the Houses of Parliament, and I really do recommend it, it's sumptuous, and it really is romantic Gothic in its full flamboyant phases. And he's largely responsible for that. From the wallpaper to the chair design, Pugin designed it all. So again, if you're a fan of Gothic and Gothic revivalism, then you can't mention that without mentioning Pugin. So think about the time of the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution. We know how Wigan was expanded. We know how the economy was expanding with the empire as well. And suddenly it was the best time in the world to be an architect because the railway stations needed building, new churches needed building, the population boomed, and hotels needed to be built, schools needed to be built. So it was really, in some ways, the golden age of architecture, and our man was in the heart of it. So let us talk about Wigan. And Waterhouse's one of the earliest works is the Wigan Ince Cemetery chapels. Now, if you go to Ince Cemetery, which I know most of you are all very familiar with Wigan, but Ince Cemetery is in front. I'm right in this, aren't I? Ince Cemetery is the cemetery in front, and then Wigan Cemetery is the one behind. So the Wigan Cemetery is the one with Lance Gibbs. And then Ince Cemetery has a couple of wonderful examples of Waterhouse's work. Now, sadly, as you will see, they're in a shocking state of disrepair. But let me tell you, before I give my moan about that, let me tell you a little bit about the building and the background. So you have 2 cemetery chapels, and as I've kind of already inferred, back in those days, there was a big gap between the Anglican Church, the Catholic faith, and also the nonconformists' faith, so people like the Quakers or the Methodists or the Baptists. So instead of them all sharing one chapel, no, couldn't do that. So they had to have 2 separate chapels. So the Catholics and the nonconformists shared one chapel, and the Anglicans had another chapel. And this building here is the Catholic nonconformists, and then there's a partition in the middle between them, so they could have their separate services. So as you can see, it's one of Alfred's earliest work. Now, as with a lot of his work, he won this in a competition, so he would have put forward draft proposal, and then the awarding committee decided that his was the finest work. It was his first public building, moving from domestic architecture. So before he'd done a few early works around houses, etc. But this was his first public building, which was going to be for public use. And the Anglican chapel can accommodate 60 and has a little bell area. And the other chapel was shared, as I said, by Catholics and dissenters, and divided by a partition and accommodates 30 each in its design. The builders were James Fairclough, and the Protestant chapel was £385, and the shared chapel was £450. And as well as the two chapels, at the front of Ince Graveyard, there's also a domestic residence, a lodge, and I'll show you that building in due course. The shared chapel has a mini apse, so this circular part at the back. So next time you do pop along to Ince Cemetery, have a look at this, and it's the second chapel. So as you come in, it's on your left-hand side. The Anglican chapel is the first one, and the shared chapel is the second one, and it has this curved apse on the round. You can see vegetation has kind of really taken over now, and it's in a sad, shocking state of affairs. All of it's rock-faced with ashlar dressing, and if you get closer to the building, some of the detail, even though it's in a shocking state, is magnificent, and it really is heartbreaking to see. But thankfully, the lodge and the front, which is now a private residence, is still in very good order. And as you can see, it's got some nice features about it, the two chimneys, and it's well looked after and well preserved. So we do have a good example in Ince of Waterhouse domestic. It's private owned and maintained. So I was very tempted to knock on the door and say, can I have some photos of your house? But people don't really like that when I do that, so I've tried to cut it down. And it's not the only example of Waterhouse's domestic work, or Waterhouse's work, which is now utilised as domestic architecture, as we'll see. But it is a fine example of a good residence. So if anyone's here tonight who actually lives there, then please invite me round so I can have a look in the interior. But sadly, as I mentioned, it's not all good news, and it really is. I've put here Ince Cemetery Chapel, the town's shame. These photos I took last summer, but I went there on Sunday just to see if it was still in a bad state of repair, and if anything, it's even worse. So it is heartbreaking. You can see here the roof is, the tiles are all broken. There's trees growing through it, and although with a blue sky, it has a certain degree of faded grandeur, ultimately it's heartbreaking to see. And for somebody who's such an important architect, in one of his earliest jobs, for it to look like this is very frustrating. Now, I don't want to stand up and really slag off Wigan Council here, because they do some things okay, maybe not architecture, and don't get me started on the gallery scheme. But I think anybody who loves history, who loves heritage, and who loves good buildings to be preserved, knows that this is not the way it should be, and it's a shame. So it is responsibility of Wigan Council. They've let it to rot and collapse, which is criminal neglect and heartbreaking. And that's all I'll say. I won't turn it into a big rant, but I've made my point. Okay. Another early job of an example of Waterhouse's work is open to some debate. Now, I can't give you a 100% guarantee that he did this piece of work, because there's some parts on the internet that says he did, and other people say, no, we haven't got any proof. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Waterhouse was doing some work in Wigan in the 1850s and 1860s, in his start of his career. Would it really be that surprising, particularly when we know that the architectural practice he'd been working in had also done some work on King Street, if he'd been involved in some building work within Wigan? No, I don't think I'm pushing it. You know, if I was claiming that he did some work in the house where I'm living, yes, possibly that would be me pushing it. But in this case, I think it's a credible claim. So this is the Minorca Hotel, which some of you may recognise as the Berkeley Public House. But before it was the Berkeley, it was quite a famous hotel in Victorian Wigan, the Minorca. So as I've put here, whilst establishing his reputation, Alfred had to be more open-minded about which work he accepted. We've all been in that position, haven't we? And thus, in 1857, he was commissioned to carry out alterations or improvements on the Menorca Inn. The original building itself dates the 1820s. Now, the Berkeley Public House, it once had a grill room. I think it once had a Burney Inn as well. Those of you who've been in the residence are probably more familiar with it than I. And a ladies' tea room upstairs, which sounds exceedingly genteel. Now, last time I was in the Berkeley, exceedingly genteel wasn't the phrase that necessarily came into my mind. I mean, it wasn't a bad pint. Obviously not as good a pint as here, and I highly recommend you get a pint at half time, by the way. Yeah, that's the advert. So it's not exactly clear what part of the building Mr. Waterhouse was responsible for, but for me, it's certainly a good excuse sometimes to pop in for a pint, just to do a bit of research. I mean, I'm sure he must have done some work here as well, so I might have to stay for an extra pint at the end, just to make sure. Okay, so that's the shame. And this is, again, another upsetting thing. So far, we've got one lodge, which is in a good state of order, the chapels, which are in a dreadful state of order, a pub, possibly, and now we've got a building that disappeared. I say disappeared, it was basically replaced. You all know the Lineker Centre, and you people know more about Wigan history than me, I'm sure, and you all know that before it became the Lineker Centre, it was Wigan Grammar School. But before the building that is there now was there, this wonderful building, the original Wigan Grammar School in that site, was built, and the architecture who was responsible for that was our man, Alfred Waterhouse. You can see he has shaped this town and had a major influence. So that is why Wigan people should be proud of Alfred Waterhouse and know about him even more than they do. So, as I've put here, in the 19th century, Wigan was a town booming due to its massively successful commercial primary industries of mining in tandem with the cotton industry as well. And as it expanded, it needed more educated professionals, and Wigan Grammar School played a key role in the development of the town. So the building here opened on November the 3rd, 1879, and certainly in the Wigan Observer obituary of Alfred Waterhouse, they take pride in Alfred Waterhouse's contribution to the town and his involvement in both the school and the library. Yeah, spoiler alert, the library is coming up as well. But it's a gorgeous photo, this. You can see the red brick work of Waterhouse that we'll see in later works becomes more and more familiar, and some of the features in terms of chimneys, etc. But what did they do with this wonderful building? Well, sadly, they knocked it down, and you can see here some photos of the demolition of that original grammar school. So although when we go to the Lineker Centre, and we're grateful for that wonderful resource, and I'm sure if any of you were ex-Wigan Grammar Schools, it was a wonderful establishment, and it probably needed to expand as more and more people entered that building. It's just a shame that they couldn't have retained some of the original building and built a newer wing on top of it. But, such is life. But back in... It just is one of those things. Now, in terms of what is left of Waterhouse's original building that's still on the site, well, if you look at these gates here and go and see the building tomorrow, to me, and I haven't carbon dated it, to me they look like originals. So it's a point that's interesting. However, one wonderful example that we still have in Wigan of Waterhouse's work is what was originally built as Wigan's library. So it was funded, for those of you who know, which is now the home of the Museum of Wigan Life, Wigan Museum. It was originally built as Wigan's library. So it was funded by a gentleman called Thomas Taylor, who was the local mill owner. Hence why, if you have a look at the side of the Wigan Museum, you'll see a coat of arms above the coat of arms of the Wigan Moot Hall. And that's the Taylor's coat of arms. The building replaced the 1723 classical grammar school building. So it's a little bit confusing, but that was where the original grammar school was built. Then it became a library with this new building, and then it became a museum. And the Gothic brick building with stone dressing, I'll show you some exterior shots in a moment. It's got a stepped window, lights in the Library Lane part. It's corbelled out chimney on its Rodney Steep gable, and it's got original shelving and a complex arrangement of galleries. Now, I'm sure all of you have been to Wigan Museum. If you've never been upstairs in Wigan Museum, it really is one of the hidden gems of the town, and I'll show you a shot of that as well. But you being you lot, I know you would have gone there, but you know, if I give this talk to other people who've never been to Wigan Museum, then I have to prepare them for what a wonderful resource the building is, and what amazing architecture are inside it. And its architectural style was described as an economic and eloquent essay, which is not my phrase, but beautifully mentioned in Victorian times of the day. So a little bit more about Victorians knew how to do things in style, so instead of just opening the library, they decided to have a celebratory lunch in Wigan Hall. And this beautiful invitation on both sides, you can see the gilded detail on that as well. So I literally went upstairs in the library, they passed me a few boxes, and I was working my way through various boxes, and I found this wonderful document of the celebratory lunch, where amongst the honoured guests, there'd be the Mayor of Wigan, etc., was in fact Alfred Waterhouse. So it really is, it shows you. On the other side of that was the menu, and as you can imagine, it wasn't burger and chips. It was a 6 or 7 course menu with cigars, etc., the full works. They knew how to do things back in those days. Okay, and as I've mentioned before, the magical kingdom upstairs, and you guys will know all this, but a visit upstairs is highly recommended to appreciate the beauty of the building. And sometimes when you go into the museum, you can get distracted by the exhibition that's on, or you're seeing some of the wonderful parts of the Egyptian collection. But next time you are in the museum, just have a look at the building. Both the little interior touches, and appreciate the work of Waterhouse. Now, it contains a number of gems, such as that luncheon invite, and as I went through some of the wonderful stuff that they've got in their collection, I looked at some of the lectures that the library was given back in the 1920s, and it was very much involved in educating the good people of Wigan and getting them involved in thinking about the world. So, you know, the British Empire was at its pomp and circumstance back in those days. So amongst the subjects that were being mentioned in Wigan Library in the 1920s was lectures on Thomas Hardy, Mesopotamia and Uganda. So it just shows you, you know, you think of Wigan in the 1920s, you wouldn't necessarily think it was an intellectual hub, but it was. And, you know, the library was definitely driving that forward, which was great to see. And it's also held an exhibition of its gems, which included the chair of Rochdale poet Edwin Waugh. Now, I wasn't that familiar with the works of Edwin Waugh, but then I did a bit more research, and he wrote about the cotton famines of the 1860s. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the cotton famine of the 1860s, this was highly significant because basically the US Civil War meant that the Wigan cotton industry that was so reliant on the cotton pickers and the cotton arriving from the south of the US meant that suddenly all the factories in Wigan closed down. And it meant that the people had great hardship, particularly the girls who were working in the mills had great hardship for a period of years, and some people starved. And it's why the Coutts factory was originally set up to try and provide some sources of employment for those people that were affected by the famine. So again, it's just I get down these little tangents of interest in terms of how it affected, you know, something that happened thousands of miles away affected the people in Wigan. So in the higher reading rooms, if you go upstairs, you'll see that the bays are integrated with the posts of the arch-braced roof trusses. And look at the floor tiles and internal features. Particularly if you go in the hallway, before you go upstairs at the back of the museum, have a look at the floor tiles, and you'll notice some really subtle but Victorian beauty And, you know, sometimes you're just going upstairs because there's a talk on or whatever, but just stop and look and you'll appreciate some of these touches that Waterhouse has applied, and it's still there to be seen in Wigan. Of course, you all probably know that George Orwell studied for his seminal work on urban poverty, The Road to Wigan Pier, and upstairs there's now a permanent collection to George Orwell. I'm very conscious that somebody with a southern accent talking to a group about Wigan, George, I mean, to me, the Road to Wigan Pier played a vital role in building the welfare state, and we should all be grateful for it. But I know that there is a feeling that here was a typical southerner coming up to the north, being patronising about a local town, and then going away. So I understand the viewpoint on both sides of the argument as well, and perhaps that's for another evening to debate whether the Road to Wigan Pier was good or not. You can ask me at the end. Okay, moving beyond Wigan, one example of domestic architecture was this wonderful building here called Eaton Hall, which is arguably his greatest domestic work. Now, it was the largest country house built in probably the 19th century, and it was built for the first Duke of Westminster. Yes, it's that Duke of Westminster who still today owns much of Belgravia, Mayfair, and has, I think he's still one of the richest, even with the tech millionaires, he's still one of the richest people in the country. It was built 1870 to 1882. Imagine that, having builders in for 12 years. I mean, how many cups of tea would you have to make in that period of time? It's 3 miles south of Chester in terms of getting your bearings. And as I've put there, it was the most expensive domestic house built in the 19th century in the UK. Now, it cost at the time approximately £600,000. To give you a valuation, when I valued this originally in 2021, I calculated roughly on the internet, on some of these comparison sites, £85 million. But now, with builders being what they are, and with the inflation that we've had in the last 12 months, I think you'd be lucky, you know, you're definitely talking over £100 million. If you were to have it built today, then dream on for 1,000 million. You know, depending on the builders that you could find, etc., etc. Sadly, it was demolished in 1963, although the only part that still remains is this wonderful chapel. And again, it's heartbreaking that we lost one of the great gems of this country. You know, to me, I look at that, and if you didn't know where it was, you'd possibly say Versailles or some baronial mansion in Germany. But it's sad to think that we had that 3 miles south of Chester and it was destroyed. So it's why it's so important for us to protect our heritage, because once it's gone, it's gone. Okay, how are we doing for time? We'll do a little bit about Liverpool, then we'll break halfway through Liverpool. We'll give you a chance to re-top up your glasses or your coffee, and then we'll carry on with Liverpool, channel through Manchester, and end up in London before we enter it. So I hope we're all okay. So I'll do a little bit about Liverpool first. Now, I'm glad that this is this Monday rather than last Monday, because as a Manchester United fan, talking about Liverpool at a 7 o'clock start last Monday would not have been appreciated. Although all I can say is, and especially for the outside world who might be watching this broadcast, is Bournemouth. Okay, right, anyway, Liverpool is a great city and has amazing architecture, and Alfred was born there, so it's only right we pay full attention and give full credit to some of his great buildings in Liverpool. This is a wonderful building, the Northwest Hotel. So I've already mentioned in London, the Midland Hotel. This was the age of the start of the Victorian train industry. We did it in this country first, and we did it best. And if you're like me and you like Michael Portillo's train journeys around the country and the world, then you'll have a passion for railway architecture. As well as amazing stations, we also made amazing hotels for those stations. And this is a great example, the North Western Hotel, built 1868 to 1871. Now, in case you're not familiar with the Northwest Hotel, you're not quite sure where in Liverpool it is, Liverpool Lime Street. So Liverpool Lime Street Station is basically here. You walk out, you look to your right, and that's the Northwest Hotel. I mean, opposite it is the wonderful example of St. George's Hall, which is classical architecture. So for those of us who are in the Gothic architecture, we get outside and we boo, we go, woo, classical, woo. No, and we face this way to look at the great Gothic magnificence that is the Northwest Hotel. Now, again, Mr. Waterhouse, Alfred, won the commission for the building because he entered a competition and he was the competition winner. And once the great age of the railway travel and the great railway hotels ended, then sadly a lot of these hotels closed. And for a period of time, it was converted into student accommodation. Now, I was a university student, believe it or not. Sometimes my parents thought I was never going to be anything but a university student. That's another story. But I can assure you that in all the different university student accommodation, none of it looked like that. But it was converted for a period of time into student accommodation. If you look at the design, you'll see that it's symmetrical except for different oriels in the end pavilions. And it's got two towers with short spikes flanking the side entrance. Notice the two towers. If there's one thing that Waterhouse liked in his design, was towers. It just added drama, it added flamboyance, and quite often it was there for a function as well. Now, I've mentioned it was student accommodation, but I had to change that slide because it's now recently been rebought by a hotel company and is now Radisson. What does it look like since they've refitted and turned it into a hotel? Well, you'll just have to look at the hotel website and wait to find out. Okay, so the last building I'll talk about before we have the break is situated at the top of Brownlow Hill, and that's the Royal Infirmary, opened in November 1889. There were two preceding infirmaries in Liverpool. One was built in 1748 in Shawbrow, close to the site, now occupied by St. George's Hall, that building I mentioned just recently. And this was replaced in 1824 by a second infirmary designed by John Foster and built on the higher and healthier ground of Brownlow Hill. So if you think about how toxic the air was back in those days with all the chimneys and all the coal and the acid rain, then any type of relief to get away from the sooty air was as beneficial as you could possibly get, which is why they built the hospital there. It became the Royal Infirmary following a visit by Queen Victoria in 1851 to Liverpool. But they needed to expand because the population was just increasing. You think about how important Liverpool was back in those days. It was arguably the second most important city in the whole British Empire. Manchester might argue the point, Dublin might argue the point, Glasgow might argue the point. But there's enough Liverpool people to say, without our docks, the British Empire and the country wouldn't have survived or succeeded. So you can see what the Royal Infirmary looks like on that picture on the left-hand side. And I was fortunate when I took that. It was a beautiful sunny day, and that red brick and the terracotta fixtures and features of Waterhouse were like glimmering and shimmering. As I said, by the 1860s, the second infirmary was already badly overcrowded and ill-equipped to count with the mounting pressures of population, medical services and medical education provision. And in 1885, Waterhouse was commissioned to build this building that you now see on the left-hand side. He corresponded with a very famous medical person, Florence Nightingale, and she succeeded in influencing his designs, including the wards, their height and the number of beds to ensure sufficient daylight and ventilation. It was Liverpool's as a third purpose-built infirmary, refurbished in the 1990s, because once it stopped functioning as a working hospital, it was then taken over by the university and was refurbished in the 1990s by the university department. And you can see here on this closer picture, it's got common brick with the red terracotta dressing, with some Romanesque Gothic features, including this lovely little entrance here. And the building's design was innovative, because that was the great thing about Victorian Gothic revivalism. Yes, it drew its inspiration from medieval inspiration, but it also took the very best of Victorian engineering and science and modern materials. So it was the earliest examples of circular ward use in the UK for large-scale new hospitals in England. Waterhouse had visited this design of this new futuristic type of hospital in Antwerp, and he'd used this even though Florence Nightingale wasn't a fan of them. And then 89 years later, when medical services were transferred to the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, the building was boarded up and remained unoccupied until, as I said, in the 95, the university took ownership of the Grade 2 listed building and the gradual refurbishment occurred. And you can see, I mentioned the tower, and he beautifully combines both form and function in the building. The tower is very much a feature of his work. It combines beauty with functionality, because remember, this is a hospital, so it's got things like boiler rooms to heat the wards, and it's got a mortuary. One of the patients, and a bit of a sad story this, was Robert Tressel, who was the author of The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, which was a very influential piece of work at the time, which again dealt with urban poverty, and in many ways is a precursor to Orwell's work of The Road to Wigan Pier or Down and Out in London and Paris. But sadly, Robert Tressel had a very bad life in terms of suffering from poverty and deprivation, and he died here in this hospital of TB in 1911. And my last slide before we have our little break is the interior of the hospital is exquisite. You know, this is a hospital, and you can see with the marble staircase and these little, you know, this was before the NHS. So instead, now we tend to have dedications maybe on a park bench. But those days before the NHS, sometimes if people had a bit of a legacy or had some money to spare, what they would do was endow a bed. So other sick people would benefit from the fact that there would be a bed available in hospitals as well. So it's a nice little touch. And you can see there that in the hospital, there's a little plaque to say that the bed was endowed in memory of her father, who died in 1898. So there's little memories that these are real people within real buildings. So as well as admiring the buildings, there's always a story of humanity behind all this. So we'll stop here for a little break, and then we shall continue. And last mention of the Royal Infirmary, of course, as one would expect of any hospital in the UK, has been used as a location for casualty. And the infirmary now, in terms of the university establishment, is now known as the Waterhouse building, with most of the original wards converted into state-of-the-art teaching. And it's not his only example of a hospital, as we shall see later on when we look at some of his buildings in London. Okay, thanks. Okay, so welcome back, and thanks for coming back. It's always a relief to see you. One never knows. And so far, no one's thrown any glasses at me, so that's a good sign as well. So thank you for your patience, and sorry if I've been a bit longer than expected, but the best is yet to come. Okay, so you'll remember that when we left each other, when we parted so sadly but romantically, at the end of part one of the talk, we were in Liverpool. And that's where we find ourselves again, in wonderful Liverpool. Yes, you can almost hear the sound of the Mersey ferry. Is that the Beatles I hear? Okay, are you transported into Liverpool now? Good. Welcome to another Waterhouse triumph in the great city. The Victoria building on Brownlow Hill. And again, I was lucky that when I took the photo of this wonderful building, it was bright sunshine and blue skies. It was very unusual, I know. And this is designed as part of the university complex in 1889 to 1892, and it still is part of the university complex today. And there's a wonderful description of this building, which I think not only symbolizes the building, but in many ways the heart and soul and spirit of Liverpool itself. Stridently red and assertively Gothic. the Victorians just had that way of describing words. It's faced with Raban brick and terracotta, and Waterhouse definitely knew how to get the most out of that combination of brick and terracotta. And the construction, I mentioned again, using modern materials, but taking the past as inspiration, and that is truly what good architects do. And the construction is fireproof with iron frame and concrete floors. So he was using the latest Victorian technology when he built this, which is only right in a progressive building such as a university. He also designed nearby buildings such as the Walker Engineering Laboratory and the Thompson Yates building and the Whelan buildings with his son. And this is a feature in some of his later works, that his son is now also an architect and designing the work with father and son team. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the family in due course as well. So we've talked about some of the educational buildings and we've talked about the chapel, but more about domestic architecture. And this is one of his more lesser known buildings, is New Hayes. So this is built on the west side of Allerton Road, if any of you are familiar with the Liverpool area. It's a suburban mansion built 1861 to 65, so it's one of his earlier works, and it was built for the lawyer W.G. Bateson. So yes, even then, as now, the lawyers had all the money. It's 3 miles south of Liverpool city centre, and it's a large but compact asymmetrical block in polychromatic brick. Now, polychromatic brick is not easy to say, but basically what it means is you're using different colours. And Waterhouse was a master at using different colours and shade to enhance brick buildings, which even on a grey British winter still looks stunning. And he used steep roofs and square-headed windows. And you can see that although it's not a massive building, it definitely has some nice figurative touches. The entrance front has a porch with geometric tracery in pointed windows and a V-plan. And there's a veranda on the west and a garden front and a conservatory. So in that area, it's a wonderful house. However, you know what it's like. If one of your neighbours in Victorian booming time suddenly builds a house, well, the next rich neighbour wants something by the same architect, and preferably something bigger and something better. And that's exactly what happened. Allerton Priory. So it's called a priory, and we'll get to the reason why it's called a priory, but it was originally built as a private house. It was designed in 1866 by Waterhouse, but for a gentleman called John Grant Morris, who was a colliery owner. So again, we talked about the colliery industry and how important it was back in Victorian times. And of course, we know that although the poor guys who had to go down the pit were paid pittance and had to suffer a terrible health and safety record, the miner owners, the colliery owners, had fortunes. And this structure was completed in 1871. It cost over £16,500 when it was built, which roughly is £2.5 million in today's money. But again, some of these modern comparisons with what money was back in those days, they're not 100% accurate, and they're only as good as the snapshot you take at the time. It's a large asymmetrical house, rather dour, some architectural people have described it, in brown brick laced with blue brick bands and sandstone dressing. And its entrance front has got a Gothic touch with the vaulted porch and a dominant tower. Remember how I mentioned that one of the features of Waterhouse was a tower, and you can see here that, again, it's part of very much his modus operandi, was one of his feature of his work. Use terracotta, use brick, throw in a few Gothic touches, and have a tower that dominates the building. The upper stage has tourelles, which are smaller towers, and on top is a steep, truncated pyramid roof. So it had some nice architectural touches, and of course, it must have dominated all the other houses around. You know, the owner mustn't have been that much of a modest man. However, What the good Lord gives, the good Lord takes away. And when John Grant Morris no longer was with us, what happened to the building? Well, he was, John Grant Morris was mayor, but once he left the building and died, then in 1897, the Catholic Church bought it. So Monsignor Nugent founded a House of Providence as a refuge for unmarried Irish girls. And this was one of the notorious Magdalene institutions. Now, if any of you know anything about the Magdalene institutions, you might have seen that film. What was it called? Philomena, that's the one, thank you. And then, unfortunately, it was often an excuse for cruelty, slave labour, and abuse. And sadly, it's hard that with a wonderful building like that, you have a sad backstory of the Magdalene institutions. And even now, and as you might have guessed, with a name like Sean, I've got Irish roots and Irish Catholic roots. So it's a source of frustration and embarrassment that the Roman Catholic Church definitely dropped the ball on this part of its past and its history. In 1917, it was certified, and I'm using words of the time at the time, Allerton Priory Special Industrial School for Mentally Defective Girls Under 15. Now you hear phraseology like that and words like that, and immediately in your head, you hear safeguarding and alarm bells ringing, and one dreads to think what possible abuses of power happened in such a beautiful building. But unfortunately, we have to be open and we have to acknowledge that some of this did in fact happen. It actually ceased to be a Home Office school in 1933, and the nuns owned the property up until 1986. So fairly recently, really, when you come to think of it, which is why the nuns' ownership is why it was called the Priory. It then became a nursing home, and now has been converted to luxury apartments with the ghastly name of Ye Priory Court. I know. Don't blame me. It wasn't my idea. A bridge over the drive was demolished, but most of the other original features remain. Now, I know what you're desperate to see is a picture of inside. So, as they said on that programme, come in through the keyhole with me. And as one would imagine, with a luxury interior, yes, the company has spent a bit of money doing the conversion. The poor under 15-year-olds girls who were probably having to clean the laundry, they weren't living like this, you can be assured. So here's an example of what the building looks like today in the interior. An entrance hall runs into the gallery, running through the southern front, but not reaching it because it's blocked at the end by a link with a sliding screen. And the stairway opens directly to the gallery, and it's got some lovely interior touches. I know it might be a little bit difficult to see, but the wrought iron balustrade there on the staircase is a particularly nice touch. And the ceilings themselves, again, are gorgeous. So it's a good example of preservation. And again, the question you were thinking, how much would a property like this set me back? Well, on prime location, I did a little bit of research, and the estate agent is looking over 580,000 for a 3-bedroomed, 3-bathroom apartment, and a 3-bedroom duplex is about 400,000. Now, I looked, and service charges weren't listed, so buyer beware, because quite often the sting in the tail on these type of properties would be the service charges. But if you do want to own a taste of Waterhouse, and if you do buy an apartment here, then do be sure to invite that lovely, charming guide who once gave a presentation about Waterhouse to your welcome home party. So now I'm moving swiftly on because I felt like a bit of an estate agent at that part of the presentation. Don't worry, I'm not going to be selling you timeshares at the end of this. Okay, so we've moved from Liverpool into that other great northwestern city of Manchester. And I mentioned right at the start of this evening's presentation, 5 hours ago, you might remember it. Thanks for hanging in there. Manchester Town Hall is probably Mr. Waterhouse's finest achievement. And this really lives up to that title of Wagnerian Gothic. Now, if, like me, you watch programs like the Yesterday channel, you might have seen at 7 o'clock this morning, there was actually a program this morning about Manchester Town Hall. Yes, the homework I put in for you guys is unbelievable. Now, they've recently done a rebuilding or repair work, restoration work on Manchester Town Hall, as anybody who's been to Manchester is probably aware of. And that, I think that's coming towards the end, if not at the end, but it really is a gorgeous building. I haven't gone to town with massive details about Manchester Town Hall on this presentation, because I'd rather speak about some of the lesser known facts. But if you haven't been inside, as soon as the tours start, I highly recommend it. Just to give you a little bit of the background, the project was conceived in 1863. The Manchester economy was at the height of its success, Cottonopolis, that phrase I've used before. Manchester wanted to lay down a statement in stone that here was the city that made the empire run, and that it needed a building that recognized and that symbolized that. And what they created, what Alfred Waterhouse created, was this amazing town hall. It's got, again, there was a two-stage architectural competition. Stage 1, 137 architects entered, and stage 2, it was narrowed down in 1867 to 8 finalists, and they were assessed by a gentleman called Professor Donaldson and that other prominent Victorian architect I've mentioned before, G.E. Street. Now, those of you who know your Wigan architecture will be familiar with G.E. Street, because he did a couple of buildings in Wigan, including Wigan Hall. So opposite the bus station, you have that marvellous Tudor, the mock Tudor, fantastic building, Wigan Hall. That's a G.E. Street. And the church up the road in Swinley, that's also a G.E. Street as well. So he was influential. And then Waterhouse won the competition, and he built this, a building of great subtlety and refinement. Inside, probably the highlight of Manchester Town Hall is the Great Hall, and the great Victorian art critic Ruskin called it the finest Gothic building in the whole of Europe. So, it really did achieve that impact that the Mancunians were hoping. It's a difficult site to fill, because if you ever are in Albert Square and you look in front of, see an aerial shot of Manchester Town Hall, it's actually on a triangular plot, which made its design even more inspirational and innovative. So it really is, as the critic Philip Williamson said, it's a triumph at every level. So that's Manchester Town Hall. He also designed a more notorious building in Manchester, and as I've put here on the top, I do not have any personal experience, I can assure you, of the interior of this building, but it's probably one very familiar to you just by watching on the news. I'm not trying to imply anything, which is Her Majesty's Prison, Strangeways. And this was designed in 1866 to 68, and it featured a high minaret chimney pot, which is part of the ventilation system. If ever you're walking around and you see that minaret, the first time I came to Manchester, I naturally assumed, oh, there must be a mosque in the distance. It was only when I was staying in the Park Inn, which has a lovely view of Strangeways, from the higher rooms, then you see the minaret and you suddenly work out, oh, it's actually part of the prison. So that's a wonderful feature. Again, combining form and function and using that influence of the exotic east of the empire and using that on domestic buildings on a prison. You look at how they build and design prisons now, it's purely functional, whereas the Victorians, even with their sewage works, would throw in a degree of architectural and artistic flamboyance, which is why I love them so much. So Waterhouse took his model of the Joshua Jebb radial plan. So without getting too technical on the design of prisons, basically it meant that they had a circular area where if you're a prison warden, you could look down the corridors and see what was happening in all the cells, rather than have it as a box effort where you literally had to walk up and down the various corridors to see if people were misbehaving. And so 6 wings radiate from the center, and outside, and you can still go outside now, you can see the beautiful picture here, which I took one day when I went to Manchester with the pure function of just trying to take some exterior shots. There's this wonderful brick design, again, terracotta facing and white stone, and it has the gatehouse has the octagonal turrets as well. So if one could describe, and again, I'm a little bit reluctant, but if one could describe a prison as being pretty, then this is a pretty prison. And I certainly wouldn't have been able to say that if I'd had a pint. Now, in terms of its famous inmates, it's had a degree of famous real inmates and a degree of fictional inmates as well. So some of the famous inmates it's had within Strangeways are those inspirational suffragettes, Christabel Pankhurst and Emily Davidson. Some rather less inspirational figures included Harold Shipman. I won't repeat the joke I did last week to an older group about Harold Shipman. Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, and Ian Brown, the former singer of the Stone Roses. Any of you music fans will know him. He had a bit of air rage and ended up in HMP prison. In terms of fictional characters, and I apologise to people who aren't fans of Coronation Street, because this stuff will just go over your head completely, but if you are a fan of Coronation Street and Weatherfield, well, the number of Corrie people who've been in Strangeways is mind-blowing. Let me take you through some of the roll call. First of all, the MacDonald family, sure, didn't Steve, Jim MacDonald, sure, I was in the big house, sure I was. His son as well, Steve MacDonald, went there. Don't worry, I'm not going to do an impression for every single member of Coronation Street. Don Brennan, you remember him, he was married to Ivy Tilsley. This is Coronation Street gold for you fans. And lastly, Ken Barlow, who in 1967 was sent to Strangeways for refusing to pay a fine. Now, I was too young to see that particular episode of Coronation Street. But it was, if you think back in the 60s, it was probably an anti-war or pro-C&D demonstration. Either that or he just didn't bring his library book back in time. So one never knows with Ken. I think he was still on wife number 1 or 2 at that stage. Okay, moving on from Strangeways, we've got a wonderful example here of another hotel. Now, this was originally insurance offices, but is now being converted to a hotel, which is the Palace Hotel in Oxford Street, Manchester. So if ever you go to Oxford Street with a train station, this is within view of the train station. So you can see there that it's a marvellous terracotta building, again in the centre, dominated by a tower. Stage 1 was 1891 by 90 to 95, which was all the work of Alfred Waterhouse, but stage 2 was again in coordination and in tandem with his son. Remember, Alfred was born in 1830, so by the 1890s, he was rightly winding down in terms of his career and letting his son take on more responsibility for the building. And this is the interior, and you can see here some beautiful tile work inside. It's at the corner of Oxford Street and Whitworth Street. Look at the tiles. Now, not everyone was a fan of his overuse, some would say, of the tiles, as we shall see in one of his later buildings. Decoration is of the Northern Italian 16th century era, so there was a nod to the Renaissance. So again, it showed that Waterhouse was prepared to mix and match from different ages. It was the former home of the Refuge Assurance Company, and it was converted into a hotel which opened in 1996. Now, it was built in 3 phases. Phase 2, building by the son, Paul, 1910 to 12, doubled the facade and linked the building by the clock tower. So again, his son started to adopt some of the tools of the trade of his father. So we've moved now from the northwest down to London, which brings us we're coming towards the end of his career and the end of the presentation. So I won't dwell too many, I won't talk about every single building that Waterhouse ever did, but it would be remiss of me not to mention some of his striking examples in London, because here was a Liverpool architect really making a significant, progressive and valuable contribution to the London skyline. And this, for me, is my favourite Alfred Museum, which is the Natural History Museum. And this is in South Kensington, and it's a Flemish cloth hall style with yellow terracotta facade. Just out of interest, who's been to the Natural History Museum in London? So quite a few, and if you've been, I'm sure you'll agree with me, it really is a cathedral of beauty, and it is a magnificent building. You know, I could have given a presentation alone just on Manchester Town Hall and the natural history. It also reminds me of when I was a child, and I would beg my mum whenever we'd have during the school holidays, if there was one building that I wanted to see in London, it was the Natural History Museum. Now, part of it was because of the dinosaurs and the big model of the blue whale and to see all the fantastic animal collection. But part of it was because of the incredible building itself. Even as a child, it had an impact on me. It was his first public building in London. And you can imagine, you know, the Victorian architects were like rock stars of their day. This was his first gig at Wembley Stadium. And boy, he blew the audience away with this building. It was a massive success. And even now, I would argue it's one of the top 2 or 3 buildings still in London. So he designed that 1873 to 1881, and it's been described as a Romanesque temple of nature, which again is a lovely phrase. Another example of a building in London is the National Liberal Club, which he designed in 1884 and 1887. Now, the Liberal political party, now we tend to think as quite obscure or the third force in British politics and not that important. But in the 1880s, in many ways, they were the party of government, or certainly the main party of opposition. And this is a building that's Italianate in style. So again, it shows how Waterhouse could adapt and evolve his style. Now, not everyone was a fan of this building. In fact, it was so full of glazed tiles inside that Lord Birkenhead was surprised to find it was a club as well as a lavatory. So, you know, perhaps he'd gone a little bit overboard with the tiles, but you can't please everyone all the time. But within this wonderful building, in terms of this country's political history, it was where some of the giants of liberal politics would have had their meetings and would have been having their cigars and brandy. Asquith, Churchill, Lloyd George, Gladstone would meet in this building and made some decisions. So to get a wonderful view of the Liberal Club, I really recommend a walk along Westminster Bridge, and then you'll have a look. The Houses of Parliament are in the distance, and on the right-hand side along the embankment is the National Liberal Club, and you'll see with those turrets, it really does add to the London skyline. But a lot of Londoners wouldn't even know what the building was, because generally, most of the time, it's not open to the public. Another building that again isn't open to the public, but is a striking feature on London's skyline and the streets, is the Prudential Building in Holborn. Now, if you don't know London, Holborn is very much the part of offices and legal London. And I think the only time I've been in Holborn has generally been having interviews and been in a suit and quite stressed. The rest of the architecture in Holborn, to be honest, is very utilitarian and quite ugly. And amongst all this ugliness is this beautiful, fantastic Waterhouse building. Now, he built this in 1897 to 1901, and Prudential was so impressed with Waterhouse's work that he basically became the company architect, and they commissioned Alfred and his practice for other Prudential buildings in assorted cities such as Edinburgh, Leeds, Glasgow and Southampton. And they're just 4 cities I picked out. I could have put down at least another 10, you know, so they liked his work. And if anyone's seen the film Howard's End, Leonard Bass, the character who's a clerk in there that the rich family are trying to help, he worked, you know, in the film, he works there as well as a clerk. It was decried because of the red brick by some of the critics as a slaughterhouse style. So again, you can't please everyone, but to me, if you can't like that building, you don't know what you're talking about. It's a grand Gothic office block, so very much a monument to clerical industry, but in fiery red brick and terracotta. So a very self-confident statement by a company that had money to spend and wanted to make an impression. Then you've got a rather interesting building. I mentioned that Waterhouse didn't do many churches. He did do this one in London, built as Kingsway House Chapel. Interestingly now, since the 1960s, it's the Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral of the Holy Family in Exile. And here in 2023, it's even more pertinent when one thinks about Ukrainian families in exile with recent events. And because of that, it was sold to the Ukrainian Catholics in 1967. But since the Russian invasion in 22, it really has become the focal point of resistance and solidarity for the British, or for the Ukrainian community, the British Ukrainian community, plus the recent exiles as well. So it's a building that has much more relevant significance than if I'd given this talk, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And then we've mentioned Liverpool Hospital. Also, University College Hospital on Gower Street is, again, a very interesting building. This was his last work, and he built this in conjunction with his son, Paul, 1894 to 1903. Now, University College Hospital, if ever you go along the Euston flyover, there's a new hospital building, and then around the corner on Gower Street is the older building. But basically, I was lucky enough on Open House London, where they open buildings that are usually private, open to the public. I went a few years ago on a guided tour inside, and again, there's all those Waterhouse features of form and function, practicality that we saw in the Liverpool Hospital, are repeated here as well. It's built as a massive Gothic X shape to provide maximum light and ventilation. So not only was it beautiful, but it really did provide practical solutions to modern problems that Britain, and London particularly, was facing. Because if you imagine how bad the pollution was in Liverpool back in those days, in London, because of the size of the population, it was 10 times worse. And there was also an interesting George Orwell connection, because I had to bring it back to George Orwell. He actually was married and died in this hospital in 1950, so I think it was his second wife. So it's got an interesting Orwellian road to Wigan Pier. Right, coming towards the end now, we mentioned that Mr. Waterhouse won a lot of competitions, but like anyone who's entered competitions, you don't always win every time. Either that or you fix them. But on one occasion, he entered a competition to design the Royal Courts of Justice, and his design you can see on the left-hand side. However, the successful candidate who won it, the architect, was the man I've mentioned several times already, G.E. Street, who designed the building. Now, the Royal Courts of Justice are the main civil law justice courts in London. It's along the Strand. So if ever you've seen it on the news in terms of celebrities having expensive divorces, or when George Michael sued Sony Record Company, that's where they have those main cases. Not to be confused with the criminal law court, the Old Bailey, which is further into the city of London itself. So this is along the Strand, and the Royal Courts of Justice. And you can see the design would have been quite interesting, but to be fair, Street's effort on the right-hand side, again, I was lucky enough to go on a tour of the interior of that building, is an architectural triumph as well. It's a beautiful building. So, you know, sometimes you have to share the love. Okay, so we've mentioned all about his buildings. So was that all Mr. Waterhouse did? No, I assure you. He also, and most people aren't aware of this, he also designed some furniture. And you can see here this beautiful corner cupboard dates from 1875 to 1880. And if you want to learn more about Waterhouse's furniture and his interior works, particularly small pieces, go to the V&A website, and they have some interesting examples of his work as well. You know, I don't certainly claim to be an expert on architecture. I know even less about internal furnishings, so I'll leave it there. Go to the V&A website. You know. My mum, who used to, as a child, after we saw the dinosaurs and after I was happy, used to then drag me around the V&A, which is the next museum along, to see all the dresses. So you can imagine that I was scarred as a child from that building, so I'll move swiftly on. So I mentioned about one of his famous siblings, And it was this gentleman, Edwin, the accountant. And yes, if you're quite familiar with the accountancy firm Price Waterhouse, he was the Waterhouse in Price Waterhouse. So yes, don't we love a family of smarty pants? One is a genius architect and the other one is an accountant. You can tell on his face he's an accountant. Apologies to any accountants present there. But behind every good man, of course, lies a woman. And there is his wife, a lady called Elizabeth Hodgkin. She was born 1834, so only 4 years younger than Alfred, and lived until 1918. They got married in Lewes in Sussex, which is a lovely part of the world. And she was the sister of the eminent historian Thomas Hodgkin. She was born in London, a Quaker, and, you know, again, it must have been important for Waterhouse to marry a fellow Quaker, and religion and the principles was important to him. And this photo was taken in 1862, so I think fairly soon after they'd married, and it's a cracking dress. You know, that's my only comment on the fashion. Yeah, that's a cracking dress. And I mentioned about his son already, and that's a great picture of his son Paul, who became a famous architect, as did his son. So basically it was 3 generations of architects in the family. And Paul Waterhouse lived from 1861 to 1924 and became a partner, first of all, in his father's practice, and then took over the practice in 1905. Continued his father's tradition in working on prudential buildings. So some of the later prudential buildings are works of Paul Waterhouse, and university buildings in Leeds, Manchester and St Andrews up in Scotland. And his son was Michael Waterhouse, who was born in 1888 and lived until 1968, so lived a fine age. But no one lives forever, unfortunately. And in terms of once he moved out of London, he lived in a small part of Berkshire called Yattendon, and he became Lord of the Manor of Yattendon. And in the parish church, if you go there, there's a nice memorial to him just to remember. And then outside, in terms of the grave, and I like this, rather than building some massive monument to himself, he has a very modest grave in a modest churchyard. And that's buried in the church of St Peter and St Paul's, Yattendon, Berks. So I think, in terms, I'll steal the line that Christopher Wren used on his monuments. If you want to see the work of him, then look around. And if you want to see the true testimony of Waterhouse's buildings and his lifetime, look at Manchester Town Hall, look at the London Natural History Museum, or go to the Wigan Museum and look at his work there. Thank you all so much for your attention tonight. Sorry if I've gone on a little bit longer, but you can see that this is an architect I'm very passionate about. You've all been so lovely and wonderful, and if you have any questions at the end, by all means ask them. Thanks very much. Any questions? Go ahead.
Wigan Hospital, when you look at that, it's got the towers, or the main central tower, it's Gothic. He had nothing to do with it.
No. I should know the architect of Wigan Infirmary. It definitely isn't Waterhouse. But again, it's a striking building. And one of the, one of the things I do like about the infirmary is if you walk in the entrance, on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side, you can see the names of all the donors. So if ever you're popping in and you're just walking by, then that's a nice feature. But it definitely isn't. But it's influenced by his style.
I have a couple of questions before anybody else wants to go on as well. Natural History Museum in London for me, it was the one in Manchester. I couldn't get enough of it. I spent a fair bit of my childhood in Stratford, which was a bus ride down from there, and I'd go down there and wander around there. Victorian building, not quite as not quite as Gothic as some of his. I'm guessing he didn't have anything to do with that.
No. But again, it was that the whole style was in vogue, and there was another great thing about the Victorians was there was that passion for wanting to learn about subject. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine in an age where we have the internet and we have the television and we have the radio. The Victorians didn't have any of that. They had stimulation through self-development and learning books and visiting buildings and reading newspaper, and whether it was the most modest thing of reading Dickens' latest work, or there was just that hunger for knowledge, which obviously every member of this group has, but I just wish the rest of the country had that hunger revived within them again. It seems sadly there's too many distractions and there's not enough focus on the important things.
Last question. I don't know if it's a question really, just a statement. Manchester Town Hall, conceived 1863, right in the middle of the cotton famine.
Yeah.
So some people are enough money.
I know. Yeah. I don't think we need to look back to Victorian times to know that even in times of terrible economic recession, or indeed a pandemic, there will always be rich people that will know how to make money and exploit bad situations.
Or come up with great ideas and have the money to
implement them. Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm not saying.
Oh no, and to be on a positive front, they spent that money well because it's a fantastic building. And
well, it's not a building, but one of the legacies of the cotton famine in Wigan is the plantations in A Hall.
Yeah.
The Lindsay family paid for the out of work people to go and plant trees.
Thanks. No, definitely. Hiya.
That's me.
Thank you.
How many children did he have?
6.
6?
Yeah.
Were there any of the others?
No. I think I think it was so hard to live up to the father's reputation that with many large families, you probably had some that would go, no, you're the oldest, you follow dad's footsteps, I'm going to do something completely different. But in terms of what the other children did, I couldn't tell you their occupations.
Did he remain a Quaker all his life? Because I'm surprised he was buried in an Anglican grave.
Yeah, no, I think there became a stage where it became, should we call it, politically prudent to turn over and become an Anglican. And he wasn't the only example of that. You think of Disraeli, the Victorian Prime Minister. He was born into a Jewish family, and his father immediately, even before Disraeli became famous, but the father was super ambitious, got him baptized in a Church of England, despite him having the Jewish heritage. So sometimes people would, should we say, jump horses for other reasons? Or maybe, I'm trying to use that phrase from Elizabeth I, look into his soul. Maybe religiously, he decided to change tact and join there for religious reasons rather than pragmatic.
Is his wife buried with him?
Yeah, she's nearby. Guys?
Going back to Allerton Priory.
Oh, yeah.
And the Magdalens, I think there might be a Wigan connection there because 1847, Father Nugent was the first parish priest of Wigan St Patrick's.
Right.
And he was recalled to the diocese to do charitable works, and another priest was installed. But Monsignor Nugent could be that man.
Yeah. Right. So.
And the Magdalene is just going to just a bit trivial this. I first came across that when I was listening to a Christy Moore album.
Yeah.
And there was a song, the
Magdalene Laundries. Yeah.
Magdalene Laundries.
Could you repeat the question, please? Because I'm deaf and I can't hear the question.
Okay. And the gentleman here said, remember we talked about Monsignor and he bought Allerton Priory. Well, apparently he had links with Wigan before he became a Monsignor, with Wigan St Pat's.
Yeah, the priest when it was consecrated in 1847.
Wow. So it just proves, again, the links with, you know, that's the great advantage I think Wigan has been between Manchester and Liverpool, that it has had an impact on both cities and is influenced by both cities as well, but stands alone. You know, it's an interesting dynamic between those two great cities, and yet Wigan can fight its corner and have an influence on those as well. Thanks. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again for your time and attention. It's been so lovely to come to this group this evening and see you all. And again, if you want to have a quiet word with me afterwards, I'm sure I'll be in the pub for a little bit later. But if I don't see you again, thanks very much.
Well, all I can say is thank you, Sean. So well researched, fantastically delivered, and your little digs at Wigan Council wouldn't have gone unnoticed by a lot of people here who've witnessed the desecration of so many good buildings in Wigan, and unfortunately it continues. Not without a fight, but sometimes you feel like you're speaking to the hand or whatever it is you're speaking to. Thank you once again. We really enjoyed that. That was fantastic.